By 1889, there were about 1,000 bison left alive on the entire continent, down from tens of millions only a few decades earlier. Most naturalists who studied the species assumed it would not survive the century. It had been the dominant animal of the Great Plains for thousands of years, and industrial hide hunting, backed in part by a U.S. Army campaign meant to strip native tribes of their main food source, had erased nearly all of it inside 2 generations. The idea that saved the species sounded almost as reckless as the extinction it was racing against. Instead of waiting on the government, a scattering of ranchers started rounding up whatever wild bison they could find and raising them like cattle. And animal colonists had spent 2 centuries insisting could never be tamed. Today, the descendants of that handful of survivors number in the hundreds of thousands. Bison meat is turning up in restaurants across the country, and the same herds are quietly rebuilding the prairie ecosystem the species once ruled. This is the story of how roughly 1,000 animals became an entire industry, and we're going to uncover exactly how it happened. Picture the Great Plains before any of this started. An estimated 30 to 50 million bison, spread from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River, moving in herds so large that early travelers described watching them cross the horizon for hours at a stretch. For thousands of years, they were the plains' dominant herbivore. The animal plains tribes built entire ways of life around food, shelter material, tools, and clothing, almost all from one species. Then, over roughly 2 decades in the mid to late 1800s, that number collapsed. Commercial hide hunting, fed by a railroad network that could ship hides east faster than any previous generation of hunters could have managed, turned bison slaughter into an industrial operation. The U.S. Army recognized what that meant for the tribes who depended on the species and, in several campaigns, actively encouraged the extermination. Eliminating the bison meant eliminating the food supply plains nations needed to resist being forced onto reservations. 2 forces, one economic and one military, were working toward the same outcome at the same time. By 1901, the collapse had reached its floor. Only about 23 wild bison remained anywhere on Earth, surviving in a remote corner of Yellowstone National Park called Pelican Valley, the last unmanaged herd left. Outside government land, the picture wasn't much better. In 1889, the naturalist William Hornaday published a continent-wide census that shocked the public. Just over 1,000 bison left alive in total, scattered across a handful of private ranches, 1 Canadian herd, a scattering of zoos, and the tiny federal herd in Yellowstone. Tens of millions to roughly 1,000 inside a single working lifetime. But the animals that were left weren't sitting in a national park waiting for an act of Congress. They were mostly in the hands of private individuals, people with no formal training in conservation, no government mandate, and, as far as most of their neighbors were concerned, no particularly good reason to be doing what they were doing. The obstacle wasn't just that so few bison were left. It was that almost nobody with the resources to save the species believed it could actually be managed as livestock. For more than 2 centuries, colonial and early American accounts of the bison agreed on one point: it could not be domesticated. Travelers who wrote about the plains described an animal too large, too fast, and too unpredictable to handle in any real number. Early attempts to crossbreed bison with cattle date as far back as the 1750s, and they kept running into the same biological wall. The hybrid males were frequently infertile, which meant crossbreeding could never become a repeatable, scalable solution on its own. That belief wasn't irrational. Bison are enormous, fast, and unpredictable at close range even today, and nothing about the animal had changed between the 1750s and the 1880s. What had changed was the math. With only about 1,000 individuals left on the entire continent, difficult to manage and extinct were rapidly becoming the same outcome. The people who tried anyway weren't backed by any coordinated national strategy. Charles Goodnight, a rancher in the Texas Panhandle, began keeping a small herd on his land in 1878, prompted by his wife Mary Ann's concern that the species she'd grown up seeing was simply vanishing. Around the same time, in Montana, a Salish and Kootenai man named Walking Coyote was raising 4 orphaned bison calves that had wandered home after a hunt, with no plan beyond keeping 4 young animals alive. None of these were government programs. None of them had a name yet, a budget, or a coordinated strategy. They were individual people, working with individual animals, against a scientific consensus that said the whole project shouldn't be possible in the first place. But scattered across a handful of ranches in Montana and Texas, without knowing it, they were building the only genetic stock the species had left. Walking Coyote's 4 calves are where the recovery actually starts. Within about a decade, that small herd had grown to 13 animals. And in the 1880s, he sold 10 of them, at $250 a head, to 2 ranchers on the Flathead Reservation named Charles Allard and Michelle Pablo. Both men were of mixed indigenous heritage, married into the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and neither had any formal conservation mandate. They simply kept breeding the herd. By 1907, it had grown from 10 animals to more than 700, the single largest bison herd left anywhere in North America, built almost entirely from Walking Coyote's original 4 orphans. Down in Texas, Goodnight's herd was growing too, more slowly, on a single ranch rather than a reservation-sized range. And in the East, the Smithsonian naturalist William Hornaday was doing something neither rancher was positioned to do, turning individual survival stories into public alarm. His 1889 census, the one that put the species' total population at just over 1,000, became the foundation for the American Bison Society, which he co-founded in 1905 with backing from President Theodore Roosevelt. For the first time, scattered private rescue efforts had a national organization behind them. The moment those threads came together was in 1902, inside Yellowstone itself. The park's own wild herd had been reduced to the roughly 23 animals hiding in Pelican Valley, not enough, on their own, to rebuild a population. So the U.S. Army, which administered the park at the time, went looking for outside stock. It brought in 18 pregnant cows from the Pablo Allard herd in Montana, 3 bulls from Goodnight's herd in Texas, and 21 more animals purchased from private owners, raising all of them at a newly built facility called the Lamar Buffalo Ranch. Over time, that reinforced herd mixed with the surviving wild bison in Pelican Valley. By 1954, Yellowstone's combined population had grown to roughly 1,300, up from a nucleus of scarcely more than 60 animals half a century earlier. 2 Texas ranchers, 1 Montana reservation herd built from 4 orphaned calves, and a naturalist's public census had, without any single coordinated plan, supplied the exact genetic stock the U.S. government needed when it finally decided to act. None of this made bison ranching an easy sell, even to the people directly involved in saving the species. In 1907, Michelle Pablo tried to do the obvious thing with his 700-strong herd, sell it to the U.S. government, so the country that had nearly exterminated the species could formally take responsibility for its recovery. Washington said no. The Flathead Reservation land Pablo's herd grazed on was being opened up for homesteading, and the federal government had no appetite for buying out a private rancher's bison operation. Canada's government did. It offered $250 a head for every animal delivered to a new reserve at Wainwright, Alberta. What followed was less a transaction than a 5-year ordeal. Rounding up 700 bison scattered across the open, unfenced terrain of the Flathead Reservation took teams of more than 90 cowboys, working from 1907 to 1912, driving animals toward rail cars for the trip north. Bison, it turned out, had not become any easier to handle just because a few hundred of them were now living on ranches instead of open plains. Herds broke through fencing mid-roundup, scattered across the reservation, and had to be tracked down and driven back in, again and again, across 5 full years of effort to move a single herd. That was the practical proof of what colonial-era accounts had insisted for 2 centuries. Bison could be bred and grown in captivity, but they could not be handled the way a rancher handled cattle, and anyone who assumed otherwise found out the hard way, one broken fence at a time. The species that a scattering of ranchers had bet their herds on wasn't cooperating with the idea that it had been tamed. It had only agreed, provisionally, to survive. Modern bison ranching never actually solved the domestication problem the 1907 Roundup exposed. It worked around it instead. Because bison resist true domestication, even now, more than a century of selective breeding later, ranchers manage them as a semi-wild species, rather than treating them like cattle with bigger horns. That means reinforced perimeter fencing, built taller and stronger than a standard cattle fence, wide pastures that give animals room to move without feeling cornered, and low-stress handling techniques designed to work with a bison's instincts rather than force it through a chute the way a rancher might move a steer. It's a permanent, working compromise between a wild species and a commercial industry that needs it to behave predictably enough to manage. On that foundation, the population that survived 1889 slowly built back out. Yellowstone's herd, restocked in 1902 and grown to roughly 1,300 by 1954, has continued climbing since. Today it holds between 4,000 and 6,000 animals, the largest population in North America, with continuous wild ancestry on public land. Outside the park system, the private herds descended from Goodnight's Texas ranch, and the old Pablo Allard stock kept expanding too, spreading from a handful of founding ranches into an industry spanning dozens of states and provinces. By the time the USDA ran its most recent agricultural census, in 2022, it counted 192,477 bison on private American ranches and farms, plus roughly 11,000 more in the country's federal and public herds. The product coming off those ranches echoes a version of the total use principle Plains tribes had built entire economies around a century and a half earlier. Meat is the primary driver, leaner and higher in protein than conventional beef, which is a large part of why demand keeps climbing. Hides go into leather goods, and bone and other byproducts get used the way ranching byproducts typically are, so that very little of a processed animal goes to waste. The industry itself runs on wholesale distribution and USDA inspection now, not subsistence. But the underlying instinct, using nearly the whole animal rather than a single cut, survived the 2-century gap intact. None of it happens at anything close to industrial livestock speed. Bison mature more slowly than cattle, graze less efficiently on a per-acre basis, and can't be pushed through a feedlot system the way beef cattle routinely are. Every one of those constraints is a direct legacy of the same not-quite livestock reality that broke fences during the 1907 roundup, which is exactly why the industry built from 1,000 survivors is still, more than a century later, nowhere close to full scale. The bison comeback was never only about rebuilding a population or a market. The same animals doing that work are also rebuilding the ecosystem they used to define. Bison are considered a keystone species of the North American prairie. The grassland ecosystem around them functions differently, and worse, without them in it. At American Prairie Reserve in Montana, researchers compared soil on land that had been grazed by bison for 7 years against similar ungrazed land nearby, and found roughly 15% more carbon stored in the bison-grazed soil. Grassland with deep-rooted plants is already one of the more effective carbon sinks on the planet per acre. Land that bison actively graze and disturb builds that capacity faster than land left alone. Grazing pushes grass to send roots deeper. Wallowing, bison rolling in dust or mud to coat themselves against insects, breaks up compacted soil crust so rainfall can soak in instead of running off. Their dung and urine put nitrogen back into ground that would otherwise slowly deplete. At Konza Prairie Biological Station in Kansas, a separate study found grassland grazed by bison supported up to 50% more plant species than grassland without them. Evidence that the effect isn't limited to carbon storage alone, but extends to the basic diversity of the ecosystem itself. There's a human dimension to this recovery running in parallel. An estimated 30,000 bison now live on tribal lands across the United States and Canada. Animals returned, generations later, to communities whose entire way of life had once depended on the species the U.S. government had worked to eliminate specifically because of that dependence. That relationship looks different than it did before the 1800s. Smaller in scope, running through federal and tribal reintroduction programs rather than a subsistence economy. But it runs through the same Pablo Allard and Goodnight bloodlines that repopulated Yellowstone in 1902. The industry chasing higher bison meat sales and the conservation effort restoring prairie carbon and biodiversity turn out to be the same animals, moving across the same land, for 2 different reasons that happen to reinforce each other. Run the numbers from both ends of this story. and the distance covered stops being abstract. In 1889, there were roughly 1,000 bison left alive on the entire continent. Today, the IUCN's Bison Specialist Group estimates the North American total at somewhere between 430,000 and 530,000, a recovery of more than 400-fold from the species' low point, even accounting for the wide range in that estimate. Of that total, only about 20,000 to 30,000 are held in conservation herds managed purely for ecological or genetic purposes. The rest, well over 400,000 animals, are commercial ranch stock, the actual scale of the industry this story set out to explain. The industry itself is still small relative to the meat business it's competing against, and that gap is exactly why demand keeps outrunning supply. In 2024, roughly 80,000 bison were processed under federal inspection in the United States, against roughly 35 million cattle processed the same year. Bison meat remains a rounding error next to beef, at somewhere around 0.2% of the scale. But USDA data shows American bison meat consumption has climbed more than 50% since 2010, and a National Bison Association survey found that roughly 90% of bison marketers reported growing demand in 2023, with about half of them reporting sales growth above 10% that year alone. What used to be a specialty item at a handful of ranch stores is now showing up on menus at national restaurant chains. The National Bison Association set a public target in 2017, 1 million bison across North America by 2027. Measured against the current total of roughly 500,000, that goal is still very much open. Proof that, whatever this recovery has accomplished so far, nobody running it considers the job finished. The bison alive today are not, strictly speaking, a wild species that humans simply left alone to recover. They're the result of a deliberate, unglamorous, occasionally reckless-looking rescue, carried out mostly by people with no government mandate, working from herds as small as 4 orphaned calves and as improvised as a Texas rancher's back pasture, against a scientific consensus that said the whole project probably wasn't possible. What they were saving turned out to matter for more than one reason. It's an industry now. Bison meat on more menus every year, ranches spread across dozens of states, a trade association with its sights set on 1 million animals. It's also actively rebuilding the ecosystem the species spent thousands of years shaping in the first place. One grazed acre and one wallow at a time. 2 centuries after colonists insisted the bison could never be managed, an animal that still isn't truly domesticated, even now, is quietly doing more for the American prairie than any restoration project designed from scratch could manage. If you want more stories about impossible-looking comebacks, species, land, entire industries pulled back from the edge, subscribe, because the next one starts from a number even smaller than 1,000.